At 74 years old, Evelyn Hayes stood on the manicured lawn she had planted by hand and watched Sheriff Miller change the locks on her front door. But what her ex-husband Richard didn't know, what his expensive lawyers were too arrogant to understand, was that burying a woman's past in a county evidence room doesn't erase her future. Sometimes, the very box they lock away to hide their sins becomes the exact instrument of their undoing. If you have ever watched the life you built handed over to someone who did nothing to earn it, if you have ever been told you are too old to matter, if you have ever realized that the person you trusted most was only waiting for you to become completely defenseless, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because what Sheriff Miller found inside that sealed cardboard box 6 months later will make you believe that divine justice never misses a deadline. The November wind carried a bitter chill through the valley. Evelyn wore her grey wool coat buttoned to the collar. Her hands rested deep in her pockets. Her right thumb traced the cold, heavy edge of a brass postal key on a frayed leather cord. It had belonged to her father. It was the only meaningful thing she had managed to pocket before the deputies arrived with the paperwork. Sheriff Miller had known Evelyn for 30 years. He had sat at her dining table. He had eaten her blackberry pie at the autumn festivals. Now he stood on her porch, keeping his eyes fixed firmly on the brass doorknob. He twisted his screwdriver. The new deadbolt clicked into place with a sharp, metallic snap. 2 young deputies carried 3 heavy, taped cardboard boxes out of the house. They loaded them into the trunk of a county cruiser. Richard had insisted those boxes be confiscated. He told the judge they contained proprietary company files. He claimed Evelyn might destroy his life's work out of spite. Evelyn stood motionless on the frozen grass. She watched the cruiser bounce slightly as the heavy trunk slammed shut. The sound echoed sharply across the empty driveway. A light snow began to fall. The flakes settled on the dormant rose bushes she had pruned just yesterday morning. She had spent 50 years building this life. It had taken Richard's attorneys exactly 45 minutes to dismantle it. Sheriff Miller walked down the driveway toward her. He stopped 6 feet away. He held a manila folder in his gloved hands. His badge caught the dull morning light. He looked down at the pavement. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," he said softly. "The court order is clear. You have to vacate the premises immediately." Evelyn looked at the house. The curtains she had sewn hung still in the front windows. The porch light she had left on burned weakly against the grey morning. She did not yell. She did not ask for a moment more. She did not beg the sheriff to reconsider. She pulled her collar up against the wind. "I understand, David," she said. She turned away from the house she had paid for with her youth. She walked slowly down the long driveway toward her 10-year-old sedan. Her shoes crunched softly against the freezing gravel. She didn't look back. She opened the heavy car door and slid onto the cold vinyl seat. She placed both hands on the steering wheel. The plastic felt like ice against her bare skin. She sat in the silence of the enclosed cabin. Outside, the deputies got into their cruisers. Their engines roared to life, breaking the morning quiet. The exhaust plumed in thick white clouds into the freezing air. They drove past her, one by one. Sheriff Miller's car went last. He did not look her way as he passed. In the trunk of his car sat the boxes Richard had fought so hard to secure. Richard thought he had won everything. Richard thought he had left her with absolutely nothing. He was wrong. Evelyn Hayes was exactly 74 years old. She had spent 50 years working quietly behind a man who stood at podiums. Before Richard owned a national logistics empire, he owned a single broken delivery van. He parked it on the street outside their first rented apartment. Evelyn drafted his initial business plans at a scratched kitchen table while he slept. She wrote the delivery schedules in pencil on yellow legal pads. She skipped her own college graduation ceremony to drive his supply trucks across state lines. She drove through the night while he rested in the passenger seat. She sold her grandmother's silver tea set to a pawn shop on 4th Street. She used the cash to make his first commercial garage lease payment. She painted the concrete walls of that garage herself over 3 weekends. She answered his dispatch phones for 30 years. She sat at a metal desk near the loading bays from 6 in the morning until 7 at night. She never drew a salary. When the first warehouse roof leaked in 1985, Evelyn climbed the ladder in the rain. She patched the tar paper herself because they could not afford a contractor. When the company expanded to 3 states, she managed the payroll from a typewriter. She stamped every envelope by hand until midnight. She learned the corporate tax codes by reading library books at the kitchen table. She filed the quarterly returns for the first 15 years of the business. Richard took the meetings in glass conference rooms. Evelyn stayed in the dusty warehouse office and made sure the drivers were paid on time. She knew every driver's name and the names of their children. She packed lunches for the men who had to run double shifts during the holidays. Richard told the local newspapers he built his empire through sheer determination and visionary leadership. Evelyn cut out the newspaper articles and put them in a leather scrapbook. She never pointed out that the vision was financed by her grandmother's silver. She never asked for a receipt for the tea set. She never asked for her name to be included on the corporate incorporation paperwork. She assumed marriage meant everything built by two pairs of hands belonged to one house. She trusted him completely. She trusted him because of a specific memory from their wedding day in 1974. It had rained heavily that morning. The ground outside the church had turned to thick mud. Evelyn had stepped out of the car and torn the hem of her white dress. Richard had not complained about the delay. He had knelt in the damp soil in his tailored black suit. He had ignored the mud ruining his knees. He had spent 20 minutes carefully pinning the torn fabric so she wouldn't trip down the aisle. A man who protected her from falling was a man she believed would never push her. Before the deputies arrived, her mornings had followed the same quiet rhythm for 20 years. She woke at dawn before the house staff arrived. She preferred to make her own coffee in the silent kitchen. She would stand at the large bay window and watch the sun hit the frost on the lawn. She watered the indoor ferns, sitting on the dining room sill. Every Sunday morning for 5 decades, she woke at dawn to bake the heavy rye bread he preferred. She would slice it thick and set it on a plate beside his morning newspaper. She lived a life entirely arranged around the comfort of a man who was already planning her exit. When the deputies arrived with the eviction notice, Evelyn had been standing at the kitchen island. She had been wiping flour from the granite counter with a damp cloth. The dough for the Sunday bread rested in a glass bowl near the oven. Her grey winter coat hung on the hook by the heavy oak front door. Inside the right pocket of that coat rested a heavy brass postal key on a frayed leather cord. Her father had worn that cord around his neck for 40 years. He had been the postmaster in Oakhaven. Oakhaven was a mountain town that most modern maps no longer bothered to print. He had handed her the brass key the week before his heart failed. He handed her a folded manila envelope along with it. The envelope contained the deed to the abandoned stone building. He told her the property belonged to her now. Richard had laughed out loud when he saw the deed in 1982. He had held the old paper up to the light in their living room. He called it a useless pile of crumbling rocks in a dead zip code. He told her to put the worthless paper in a box in the basement and forget about it. Evelyn had folded the paper and placed it in a cardboard box, but she had taken the brass key off its original chain. She had threaded it onto a fresh leather cord. She had kept it in her coat pocket every winter since. She kept it as a quiet reminder of a man who worked with his hands and spoke the truth. She never imagined the useless pile of crumbling rocks would one day be her only shelter. The mahogany conference table stretched 12 feet across the room. Afternoon light filtered through the tinted glass of the high-rise office. Rain streaked the large windows overlooking the city skyline. The air conditioning hummed evenly from the ceiling vents. Evelyn sat perfectly still in a stiff leather chair. She wore her grey wool coat buttoned to the collar. Her right hand rested deep in her pocket. Her thumb traced the cold, heavy edge of the brass postal key. She focused on the solid metal to keep her hands from trembling. Richard sat directly across from her. He wore a custom navy suit and a silver silk tie. His fingernails were perfectly manicured. His posture was relaxed, leaning slightly back in his chair. His attorney sat to his left. The attorney arranged 4 thick stacks of manila folders on the polished wood. Those folders contained the exact legal boundaries of 50 years of Evelyn's unpaid labor. Richard leaned forward and placed his hands flat on the table. He looked at Evelyn with an expression of practiced sympathy. "We're worried about you, Evelyn," he said in a low, measured voice. "At your age, you can't manage a house that size alone." He slid the first thick stack of papers across the table. The document stopped exactly an inch from the edge. "This is what's best for everyone," he said. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Evelyn looked down at the top sheet of heavy bond paper. The black ink outlined the division of their entire life. The attorney handed her a heavy brass pen. The metal felt cold and unfamiliar against her fingers. The attorney pointed to a yellow sticky note at the bottom of the page. He told her to initial the corner and sign the center line. As she touched the pen to the paper, Richard pulled his phone from his pocket. He unlocked the bright screen. He opened a real estate application. He began scrolling through photographs of luxury beachfront condominiums in Florida. He tapped the screen to zoom in on a balcony overlooking the ocean. He swiped through images of a modern kitchen with marble countertops. He did not look up when Evelyn signed away the corporate holding structure. He did not look up when she signed away the commercial vehicle fleet. He casually adjusted his silver tie while she erased her name from the company she built. The attorney slid the next heavy document forward. The residential properties, the attorney said mechanically, including the primary estate and the lake house. Sign on line 4. Evelyn hesitated for a fraction of a second. Her pen hovered above the thick paper. Richard finally looked up from his bright screen. "I'm not being cruel, Evelyn," he said smoothly. "I'm being practical." He set the phone face down on the mahogany table. "The company needs a modern image moving forward." He looked directly at her worn grey coat. "You were necessary for the warehouse years. You kept the lights on when things were tight. But we are a national brand now." He steepled his fingers together. "You should have planned better for your own retirement instead of relying on me." He pushed the final, thinnest folder toward her. "You're not getting nothing," he added. "You're getting a property. It's a clean break. This is fair." The national logistics empire to Richard. The 3-story house on the hill to Richard. The corporate investment accounts to Richard. While he tapped his phone screen and adjusted his silver tie, already planning the aesthetic of his new life without her, Evelyn received what they called the rest, the folded deed, to an abandoned stone building in a forgotten mountain town. Evelyn set the brass pen down on the polished wood. The metallic click echoed loudly in the quiet room. She looked across the table at the man she had worked beside for 5 decades. She thought about the nights she had painted the first garage walls. She thought about the mud ruining the knees of his suit on their wedding day. That man was completely gone. Only this stranger in a custom navy suit remained. She did not raise her voice. She did not ask for a different settlement. She did not explain what she had sacrificed for his success. She reached out and picked up the thin folder containing the mountain deed. "I will take the post office," she said quietly. She stood up from the stiff leather chair. She pulled her coat collar tight against her neck. She turned her back to the mahogany table. She walked out of the glass conference room. She walked down the long, silent, carpeted hallway. She pressed the button for the elevator and waited. The silver doors slid open. She stepped inside. The heavy doors clicked shut behind her. Evelyn sat in the driver's seat of her 10-year-old sedan. The engine remained off. Rain beat steadily against the cold windshield. The city parking garage smelled of damp concrete and exhaust. She placed her worn leather purse on the passenger seat. She unzipped the main compartment and pulled out a paper bank receipt. The black ink showed her exact total balance. She had exactly $68.42 left in her checking account. She had one crumpled $20 bill in her coat pocket. Evelyn reached into her purse again and withdrew her phone. She pressed the side button. The bright screen illuminated the dim car interior. The missed calls counter read 0. The unread messages icon showed a blank gray circle. No one from the warehouse had called. No one from her neighborhood had sent a text. The only notification was an automated alert from a local pharmacy. It reminded her to refill a daily medication she could no longer buy. She pressed the button again, and the screen went black. She placed the dark rectangle face down on the vinyl seat. The silence in the car was absolute. She looked at the thin manila folder resting on her lap. It held the deed to an abandoned stone post office. It was located in a mountain town, 300 miles north. She could drive to a crowded shelter on the east side of the city. She could call a former neighbor and beg for a couch. She could sleep in her car in a retail parking lot. She thought, "I am 74 years old and I have nothing." She looked at the grey dashboard. She thought, "If I stay in this city, I am only the woman Richard erased." She reached into her right coat pocket. Her fingers found the heavy brass postal key on the frayed leather cord. She pulled the key from her pocket. She traced the deep grooves cut into the brass shaft. Her father had trusted this key to keep important things safe. She draped the frayed leather cord around her neck. The heavy brass settled against her collarbone. She picked up the thin manila folder. She placed it carefully in the dark glove compartment. She put her right foot on the brake pedal. She pushed the metal key into the ignition and turned it. The old engine sputtered once and then roared to life. She turned the heater dial to the highest setting. She shifted the transmission into drive. She pulled out of the concrete parking garage into the rain. She turned the car north toward the mountains. She kept driving. The mountain road wound sharply upward through dense pine trees. The light rain turned into a blinding downpour. Evelyn's wiper blades dragged heavily across the glass. The gas needle dropped firmly below the empty line. She had to pull off the highway at the very next exit. The faded green metal sign read, Oak Haven. The main street of the town was completely empty. She drove past a general store with a sagging canvas awning. She passed a small diner with red checkered curtains in the window. She pulled under the metal canopy of a gas station with 2 rusted pumps. She turned off the engine and stepped out into the cold mountain air. An older man in a faded denim jacket walked out of the glass booth. Evelyn held out her single, crumpled $20 bill. The man took the money, but did not look at the pump. He stared directly at her face under the harsh fluorescent canopy light. "You have Arthur's eyes," the man said quietly. Evelyn froze with her hand still extended toward him. "Your father used to talk about you every time he came through," he said. "We've been waiting for you." He turned and started the fuel pump without asking her another question. Evelyn followed the man's directions to the end of a forgotten dirt road. She parked her sedan in front of a massive wall of overgrown blackberry brambles. Behind the thick thorns stood the stone post office. It was much worse than Richard had described in the polished conference room. Decades of thick ivy choked the heavy granite blocks. The left side of the slate roof had completely caved in. Rain poured freely through the gap into what used to be the sorting room. She stood in the freezing mud and looked at the ruined structure. She took a step back toward her car. Then she saw the heavy oak front door under the small stone archway. The wood was weathered silver but completely solid. A heavy brass lock plate sat exactly in the center of the thick wood. The metal was tarnished green, but the keyhole was perfectly clear. Evelyn lifted the leather cord over her head. She walked up the 3 cracked stone steps. She slid her father's heavy brass key into the lock. The internal tumblers clicked loudly in the quiet rain. She pushed her shoulder against the heavy wood. The door opened. The first 3 weeks inside the stone post office were relentless. The mountain cold settled deep into Evelyn's bones and refused to leave. Every morning, her swollen knees popped loudly when she stood from her thin pallet. A dull, heavy ache radiated from her lower back down to her heels. Her knuckles cracked and bled from the freezing wind blowing through the ruined walls. She had to build a daily routine to keep from freezing to death. She woke exactly at dawn every single morning. She dragged heavy, rotting floorboards out into the overgrown yard by hand. She stacked the salvageable oak planks in the dry corner of the sorting room. She found a towering stack of thick canvas mail sacks in the flooded basement. She hauled them up the narrow wooden stairs, one by one. She nailed the heavy, stiff fabric over the shattered glass windows to block the wind. She built a small cooking hearth in the center of the room, using fallen chimney bricks. She gathered dry pine branches from the forest floor behind the building. She boiled rainwater in a rusted tin bucket over the small fire. She ate plain oats purchased with her remaining $48. She washed her face every morning with the freezing water. She swept the remaining intact floorboards with a broom she fashioned from pine boughs. She was building a life with her bare hands, not just waiting to die. On the 18th morning, a rusted blue pickup truck pulled into the dirt driveway. A tall man with gray hair and a faded denim jacket stepped out. He walked directly to the collapsed section of the slate roof. He did not knock on the heavy oak door. He did not ask what an old woman was doing in an abandoned ruin. Frank set his heavy wooden toolbox down on the frozen grass. He was a man with thick carpenter's hands and very few words. He pulled a heavy canvas tarp and a bundle of cedar shingles from his truck bed. He set up a tall aluminum ladder against the stone wall. He spent 6 hours patching the gaping hole above the main sorting room. The rhythmic sound of his hammer echoed through the quiet valley. Evelyn brought him a tin cup of hot, boiled water. He took it with a slight nod and drank it silently in the cold air. He had lost his own wife to a sudden illness 3 years earlier. The quiet, heavy grief in his eyes matched the absolute stillness of the mountain. He finished the roof just as the sun began to set. He packed his tools away in the metal bed of his truck. He did not ask for a single dollar of payment. He simply tipped his hat, started his engine, and drove back down the mountain. The true test arrived on the night of the first major ice storm. The temperature dropped drastically after sunset on a Tuesday. The brutal wind ripped one of the canvas mail sacks completely from the window frame. Freezing rain poured directly into her small sleeping area. Evelyn huddled under a damp wool blanket in the absolute darkness. Her lower back throbbed with a sharp, burning pain that made her gasp. Her hands were completely numb and too stiff to retie the heavy canvas cord. She reached into her coat pocket with trembling fingers. She pulled out her dark phone. She pressed the power button. The screen illuminated the damp stone walls for a brief second. The battery indicator flashed red at exactly 3%. The missed calls counter read 0. The text message inbox was completely empty. Nobody from the logistics empire was looking for her. Nobody from her old neighborhood had tried to reach her. She dropped the phone onto the wet floorboards. She lay on the hard wood and listened to the wind scream through the stones. She thought, I cannot rebuild a stone building with my bare hands. I am 74 years old with $48 and I cannot fix a shattered window. I cannot survive a mountain winter alone. The math of her survival was too large to look at directly. Evelyn closed her eyes against the freezing rain. She thought, this is where I die. Not today, but this is exactly where it ends. This is what freezing to death alone looks like. She lay perfectly still and waited for the cold to finally take her. Then the wind shifted violently in the dark. A sudden gust blew a heavy, frozen oak leaf through the open window. The dry leaf landed directly on her chest. It struck the heavy brass postal key resting against her collarbone. The cold metal dug sharply into her skin. She opened her eyes in the dark. She gripped the cold brass key in her stiff, aching right hand. She thought about Richard, sitting in his perfectly heated glass office. She thought about him casually adjusting his silver tie while erasing her name. She pushed the soaking wet wool blanket off her legs. She sat up in the freezing rain. She spoke directly to the empty, howling room. I am not dying in this ruined post office, she said aloud. I am not dying because a man decided I was not worth keeping. She gripped the edge of a heavy stone block. I am 74 years old, and I still matter. She forced her swollen knees to unbend. She stood up in the dark. She grabbed the rusted tin bucket and walked toward the open window. She went to work. 6 months later. The mountain spring thawed the frozen mud around the stone post office. Evelyn was planting creeping thyme near the front steps. Her dark phone vibrated against the heavy canvas fabric of her coat pocket. It was the first time it had rung in half a year. The caller ID displayed the county sheriff's department. She answered. Sheriff Miller spoke quietly into the receiver. He asked her to drive down the mountain to the station immediately. She parked her 10-year-old sedan outside the brick precinct building. She walked through the double glass doors. Sheriff Miller did not greet her with small talk. He led her down a long cinder block hallway. He unlocked a heavy metal door marked with a stenciled white number. The evidence room smelled of dust and floor wax. Under the harsh fluorescent lights sat the 3 cardboard boxes. These were the boxes Richard had confiscated from her driveway. Sheriff Miller pointed to the open flaps of the first box. County policy requires a 6-month inventory of sealed civil evidence, he said. I had to open them yesterday. He pulled a heavy, rusted metal strongbox from the cardboard. Richard claimed these were proprietary corporate files. Sheriff Miller stepped back. But that box belongs to your father. Evelyn stared at the rusted green metal. The box had sat in her basement for 40 years. A thick brass padlock secured the heavy latch. She reached up with her right hand. Her fingers closed around the heavy brass postal key on her leather cord. Her hands began to tremble. She lifted the leather cord over her silver hair. She slid the thick brass key into the padlock. She turned her wrist. The tumblers clicked loudly in the quiet concrete room. The heavy lock snapped open. She removed the padlock and lifted the metal lid. First, she felt profound confusion. Inside sat 3 of her father's leather-bound postal ledgers. The ink on the covers was faded from decades of sun. Why had Richard demanded these be confiscated? Why had his attorneys insisted they were dangerous? She lifted the first heavy ledger out of the strongbox. Her breath caught sharply in her chest. Underneath her father's ledgers lay a stack of crisp corporate folders. They bore the silver-embossed logo of Richard's logistics empire. Richard had used her father's forgotten lockbox to hide his own secrets. He knew nobody would ever look inside an old postmaster's ruined chest. She reached into the box. Her fingertips brushed the edge of the first manila folder. She opened it on the metal evidence table. She read the top page. Then she read it a second time. Her lungs felt tight, as if the air in the room had vanished. The page was a bank transfer receipt from 1985. It showed a direct deposit from a corporate account into an offshore trust. The trust was registered solely in Richard's name. She turned the page. She moved to the next folder. The beginning of understanding settled heavily over her. These were not standard business filings. These were parallel ledgers. They documented 30 years of deliberately hidden corporate profits. Every time Richard claimed the company was struggling, he was moving cash. He had drained the equity while she patched the warehouse roof in the rain. She opened the third and final folder. Her trembling stopped completely. Her hands went perfectly still against the cold metal table. The full scale of the deception stared back at her in black ink. It was the original corporate charter from 1976. Evelyn's name was listed as a 50% managing partner. The seed capital listed was the exact pawn value of her grandmother's silver. Attached to the charter was a notarized document removing her name. The date on the removal was the day before her divorce was finalized. Her signature sat at the bottom of the page. She traced the blue ink with her index finger. She had never signed that paper. Richard had forged her name to steal half of an $80 million empire. He had locked the proof inside her own father's box. He had used the sheriff to carry it safely out of his house. She looked up from the papers. She looked at the empty space above the metal table. She spoke aloud in the quiet room. "You were always so careless with things you thought were worthless." She looked back down at the forged signature. Richard had left her with $68.42. He had hidden millions in stolen liquid assets behind a rusted padlock. He had handed her the exact weapon needed to destroy him. She picked up her father's brass key. Evelyn drove her 10-year-old sedan back up the mountain. She left the forged documents in the hands of a county prosecutor. She did not wait in a city hotel for the legal system to work. She returned to the damp, cold post office. She began to physically tear away the rot. She started with the exterior walls of the building. She carried a wire brush and a tin bucket of freezing creek water. She stood on a wooden apple crate to reach the high arches. She scrubbed the heavy granite blocks for hours every day. She scraped decades of dead, woody ivy vines from the stone. Her knuckles blistered and bled, but she did not stop. She revealed the pale, clean grey rock underneath the overgrowth. She baked thick loaves of heavy rye bread in her makeshift hearth. She carried the warm loaves down the mountain dirt road. She walked to the general store with the sagging canvas awning. She traded her bread for bags of powdered mortar and a steel trowel. She mixed the heavy grey paste in a cracked plastic wheelbarrow. She repointed the deep gaps between the exterior stones herself. She sealed the building against the coming winter wind. Frank returned in his rusted blue pickup truck 3 weeks later. He carried 6 large panes of salvaged glass in the metal truck bed. He had pulled them from a demolished barn down in the valley. Evelyn traded him 24 jars of wild blackberry preserves for the glass. She had picked the berries from the thorny bushes swallowing her driveway. Frank helped her lift the heavy glass into the empty window arches. They secured the clear panes with fresh white putty. Evelyn finally took down the stiff canvas mail sacks. Sunlight hit the interior floor for the first time in 50 years. The bright light revealed the absolute ruin of the rotting oak floorboards. Evelyn pried the ruined planks up with a rusted iron crowbar. Underneath, she found wide plank pine subflooring perfectly preserved by the dry dirt. She spent 14 days crawling on her hands and knees. She sanded the pine boards by hand. She used coarse grit paper wrapped tightly around a heavy brick. Her shoulders burned with a deep, sharp ache every night. She spent her first small Social Security deposit on a gallon of linseed oil. She rubbed the thick oil into the thirsty wood with an old cotton rag. The pale pine darkened into a rich, glowing amber. She took a heavy machete to the massive blackberry brambles in the front yard. She hacked away the thick, thorny vines blocking the stone steps. She uncovered a winding pathway laid with flat river stones. She planted creeping thyme and winter-hardy ferns along the rock borders. She dragged the massive wooden postal counter to the center of the main room. She converted it into a large, functional kitchen island. She sanded the deep gouges out of the solid mahogany top. She polished the brass customer transaction grate until it shined perfectly. The physical transformation reached its peak on a cold Tuesday afternoon. The autumn sun sank low behind the western ridge. Solid bands of golden light poured through the clear, arched windows. The light struck the polished mahogany counter. It threw long, sharp shadows across the amber pine floors. A fire burned cleanly in the fully restored stone hearth. The air smelled of dry cedar wood and baking yeast. The damp, rotting ruin was completely gone. A solid, warm home stood in its place. The physical restoration of the post office mirrored a deeper, quiet repair. Evelyn stopped charging her dark cell phone entirely. She stopped thinking about the polished mahogany conference table. She stopped measuring her worth by the logistics empire she had built. She found genuine peace in the heavy, deliberate work of her own hands. Word of the restored stone building traveled quickly through the valley. Mountain residents began arriving without formal invitations. The woman from the diner brought a heavy cast-iron kettle. The man from the gas station brought a wooden crate of winter apples. They did not treat Evelyn with charity or pity. They treated her as an equal who had survived the same harsh winds. She boiled hot apple cider on her new stone hearth. She poured the steaming liquid into ceramic mugs for anyone who stopped by. She had spent 50 years serving a man who erased her completely. Now, she shared her space with people who recognized her father's eyes. On a cold Thursday morning, Evelyn stood on the flat river stones near the entrance. She handed a wrapped loaf of heavy rye bread to Frank. Frank took the warm bread and nodded silently. He walked toward his rusted blue pickup truck. A sleek black town car bounced violently up the rutted dirt driveway. It stopped abruptly beside Evelyn's 10-year-old sedan. Frank paused with his hand on his truck door. He watched the strange, expensive car closely. The rear door opened. Richard stepped out into the damp mountain mud. He wore a charcoal cashmere overcoat and polished leather shoes. He looked at the restored stone walls with genuine shock. Evelyn did not walk toward him. She stood perfectly still on her own front steps. Richard forced a tight, polished smile onto his face. He pulled a thick white envelope from his coat pocket. "We've been worried about you, Evelyn," he said smoothly. "Living all the way up here, completely isolated. It isn't safe at your age." Evelyn looked directly at his expensive leather shoes. They were already ruined by the thick, freezing mud. "You didn't drive 300 miles to check my heating," she said quietly. Richard's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "There was a misunderstanding with the original corporate charter," he said. He tapped the white envelope against his palm. "The attorneys found a clerical error from 1976. I brought a certified check for $2 million. I want to make this right. You just need to sign a sworn affidavit saying the transfer was voluntary." He took a step closer to the stone stairs. "We shouldn't let a minor paperwork error destroy the empire I built. You don't know how to manage an $80 million company anyway. You were essentially just the help." Evelyn did not raise her voice. She did not demand an apology. She spoke in a calm, measured tone. "You forged my name to steal half of an $80 million company. You locked the proof inside my own father's box. You used the county sheriff to carry it out of my house." Richard gripped the white envelope tightly. His face flushed dark red in the cold air. "Be reasonable, Evelyn," he said, dropping the polished warmth entirely. "The federal prosecutors are threatening me with 50 years in prison. I am offering you $2 million. Evelyn reached to her collarbone. Her fingers touched the heavy brass postal key. "You gave me this ruin because you thought it was worthless," she said. "Because you thought I was worthless. You were wrong about both." She turned her back to him and walked up the steps. Frank opened his truck door and stared directly at Richard. Richard stood frozen in the freezing mud. He held the useless check in his manicured hand. Evelyn stepped inside the warm, sunlit building. The heavy oak door clicked shut. 1 year after the morning, she first arrived in the freezing rain. The mountain spring had returned to the Oakhaven Valley. The creeping thyme bloomed in thick purple clusters along the river stones. Evelyn stood behind the polished mahogany counter of the stone post office. Sunlight warmed the amber pine floorboards beneath her practical flat shoes. She wore a clean linen apron over her simple wool dress. She sliced a thick loaf of heavy rye bread with a serrated steel knife. Steam rose from the fresh crumb into the quiet morning air. Frank sat at a small wooden table near the restored arched window. He drank black coffee from a heavy ceramic mug. He watched a pair of robins gather pine needles on the front lawn. 3 canvas mail sacks sat in the corner, filled with winter apples. A framed newspaper clipping rested face down on the bottom shelf of the counter. The hidden text announced a 50-year federal sentence for a national logistics CEO. Evelyn did not need to look at the black ink anymore. She wiped the flour from the smooth wood with a damp cloth. She reached up to her collarbone. She unclasped the frayed leather cord from around her neck. She slid the heavy brass postal key off the worn leather. She held the cold metal in her palm for a long moment. The key had opened the rusted padlock in the cold evidence room. The key had unlocked the heavy oak door to her true life. She walked over to the thick doorframe. She hung the heavy brass key on a small iron hook by the entrance. She left the front oak door wide open to the valley breeze. She looked out at the winding dirt road. "You were right, Dad," she said quietly. "It was exactly what I needed. It was enough." Justice does not always arrive with a gavel in a crowded courtroom. Sometimes it arrives quietly, built by hand from the exact stone someone else threw away. If Evelyn's story moved you, if you've ever watched someone casually take credit for your years of quiet sacrifice, leave one word in the comments, describing the moment she left Richard standing in the freezing mud. Because Evelyn's story proves something that is always true. The people who underestimate your endurance will eventually hand you the exact tools you need to rebuild. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their greatest chapter might begin the day they lose everything. Because together, we prove that dreams don't age.